Howdy of you delicious people. We are going to do a video today really going out of our way to mention that there were a lot of very much popular movies that might have had a very different kind of title, or maybe a less popular title. Maybe we ultimately have to suggest, does a title make a movie? Does a title make a movie more interesting or less so? Because ultimately, we're going into an alternate world, an alternate time, where ultimately some movies might have been called this. There might be some titles that I might otherwise justify to you, or there might have been some titles that had been forcibly put out there just to scare people away from, dare say, taking someone's either idea or rushing or ruining the sets or just trying to disguise otherwise a movie for people to not know that it is a thing that's out there. So dare say, let's go into these movies. Some of them might be easy ones, but then some of them might be like, huh? Never knew that was a different title of a movie that I knew of. So let's go into these. I have a list here. I have a list of movies, and so ultimately we're going to go into these and justify some of them, but most of the time we're just going to go into these and just kind of maybe make fun of them. So let's go. Speaking of which, Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters originally was a cartoon that ultimately had some kind of ape and some guy in some weird ash-like vehicle. It kind of really does much more seem like Scooby-Doo. The original Ghostbusters kind of did. And so when the actual original Ghostbusters movie came out, they were looking at other titles before settling on Ghostbusters or getting the rights for the rights for the movie of to have the title be Ghostbusters. Ultimately, there was other working titles. If you watch bloopers of the very first Ghostbusters movie, you'll see other working titles like Ghost Stoppers or Ghost Blasters. There might have been actually other working titles besides that, but those seems to be the most popular ones that usually tended to come up. Also, the Ghostbusters 2016 movie was almost going to be called Ghostbusters Answer the Call, which ultimately I think you could have called that movie anything and it really would not have actually worked out regardless. Maybe, bizarrely, there were some rough titles before they settled upon the movie Ghostbusters Afterlife. Maybe Answer the Call was going to be the Paul Rudd movie. Who knows? Ultimately, Back to the Future, parts 1 and 2. The very first Back to the Future was almost going to be called Spaceman from Pluto. Ultimately, because the people who had worked on the film were thinking that future didn't work in the title, so they were going with Spaceman from Pluto. Ultimately, but jokingly, I think they put that in as a book in the movie just to kind of just go, yeah, we weren't ever going to go with that title. Evidently, Back to the Future Part 2, the pitch of that title was going to be called Paradox. Reasonably, they didn't really know if they were going to make sequels of this movie or if they were going to make what they ended up doing. Evidently, they were making a very long first film, and evidently that first film was way too expensive, so they decided to break it up into two parts. Hence why you have the movie called Back to the Future Part 2. And I think they just kind of ran with it afterwards after the success of the first film. So maybe the first film would have had a lot of Part 2 in it, but the first film was just too expensive to make. Star Wars, The Return of the Jedi. to hide the fact that realistically they did not want people to know that they were doing another Star Wars film. Star Wars Return of the Jedi was called Blue Harvest. If you go into watching the Family Guy Star Wars parody, it's called Blue Harvest. And they'll let you know that Return of the Jedi was originally called Blue Harvest to hide the fact that they didn't want people to know it was a Star Wars movie. Pretty Woman was going to be called $3,000 because ultimately that's how much Richard Gere's character was going to pay Julia Roberts to sleep with him. Ultimately, I think Pretty Woman is a much reasonable title because why would you want to put an exact dollar amount of how much this prostitute was going to get paid? I don't know. Does $3,000 sound like a reasonable movie title for you? I don't think no one would know what $3,000. What is that movie about? Like, is it a bank robbery? Did somebody steal $3,000 from you? I don't think it quite works. Friday the 13th was going to be called A Long Night at Camp Blood, I believe it was called. Or was going to be called. Looking at this, I would have much rather have called it like Camp Crystal Lake. You could have called it Voorhees. You could have called it Hockey Mask. Any title but Friday the 13th was almost going to be called A Long Night at Camp Blood. But there's going to be a lot more worse horror movies, believe me. Alien. If you remember the Sigourney Weaver movie Alien, it's fairly iconic, was almost going to be called Star Beast. Does it work? Does it not work? Who knows? The Tom Hanks movie Big. Big? That doesn't really quite work as a title now, does it? Well, the supposed title was When I Grow Up. Was the working title, but they changed to Big. I think When I Grow Up honestly actually works a little bit better than Big. Big, what is Big about? I don't know. I think When I Grow Up probably works a little bit more, maybe? Who knows? Maybe it's too long of a title. Again, I don't know. Child's Play was ultimately going to be called Batteries Not Included. If people know movies, they would probably know that Batteries Not Included was a movie title. Whether that took place after Child's Play or before so, I honestly think that Child's Play actually does... It feels like a better film than Batteries Not Included. It might have worked, it might not have worked. Who knows? Halloween was originally called The Babysitter Murders. Or The Babysitter Massacres. Or I think it was maybe just called The Babysitter Murders. Could you reasonably see sequels being done called The Babysitter Murders 2 and 3? Ultimately, Michael Myers did not kill every single person who was just babysitting someone. So really, that title really does not work. I think every time that this guy would otherwise attack people on Halloween because he's wearing a Halloween mask makes much more sense. But I think maybe they were trying to justifiably not have this person just attacking one time a year. They were thinking of trying to have it just be like he just attacks whenever. Because justifiably sometimes it seems like Michael Myers didn't exactly attack always on Halloween. Sometimes it was the seemingly, like when you go into the sequel, like he's still attacking Jamie Lee Curtis in the sequel. So the Jamie Lee Curtis movie was almost going to be called The Babysitter Murders. No. Doesn't really quite work. Point Break. If you guys remember the Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze film Point Break, this movie was almost going to be called Johnny Utah. So either way, you would have had an extremely vague like movie that you don't really probably would quite remember. Especially if the movie was called Johnny Utah. I think Point Break is a very memorable title that when people ultimately sometimes do say Point Break, especially with the Avengers kind of much more bringing it up much lately in their Avengers films or Thor Ragnarok and stuff like that. Ultimately, it's kind of really, if they would have called it Johnny Utah, I don't think it would have gone that well. Uh, they would have probably had to have called it something else. Scream! If you guys remember the Nev Campbell, Wes Craven, Drew Barrymore, number of other people on that effing thing through the numerous times that they were going to go about doing these movies. Originally, Scream was going to be called Scary Movie. Ultimately, they had decided to change the name because they evidently figured if you actually call it Scary Movie, people will not actually think it's an actual scary film. Funny enough, years later, there was a parody about Scream, and it was called Scary Movie. Snakes on a Plane. Original title was Pacific Air Flight 121. Let me reiterate that. Pacific Air Flight 121. What would you know what that movie was? Snakes on the Plane. It's very simple, it's easy to say, and ultimately it tells you what's going on in the film. Simple, effective. The Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Predator. The original title was almost going to be called Hunter. Hunter does not quite work. Hunter sounds too generic. It could have been a movie about anything. I think people would not have probably have gone and thought that it was an alien movie. Maybe Hunter would have maybe worked. I could not see building a franchise off the movie Hunter. I could see building a franchise off the movie Predator. Sounds good. Field of Dreams. If you guys remember the Kevin Costner film, kind of really cementing Kevin Costner as a star. Ultimately, this movie was going to be called Shoeless Joe. Ultimately, if people are maybe real and true baseball fans, Shoeless Joe, they would probably know who that is. But I think Field of Dreams kind of really does have a much more, like, kind of bouncing, kind of really fun kind of title. But I don't know. It could have been either way about this. I think Shoeless Joe could have may have like had people figure out what this movie might have been about more. Who knows? E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Originally, the title of this movie was A Boy's Life. First off, I would have to say, what is the movie about? It's about an alien coming from outer space. But we're going to call the movie A Boy's Life. E.T. sounds much better. The Extraterrestrial sounds much better. But I would stick with E.T. because I think, honestly, people would know what the movie's about. People would know what the movie's about. But we got some strange titles coming on down. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was originally titled Head Cheese. Was originally the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie originally done in Wisconsin? I honestly don't quite understand in my frame of mind why call it head cheese. Was the Leatherface character's face like grinded away? Were they unsure about the whole Leatherface thing? Who knows? The Sandra Bullock movie While You Were Sleeping originally was going to be called Coma Guy. I'm sorry, but the movie wasn't actually about the man who is in the coma. It's about Sandra Bullock trying to eventually find love and family and this and that. So Coma Guy sounds awful. If they would have said like coma, or if they would have had like some other working title, coma sounds just like a snooze fest. It really does. Harry Potter the Sorcerer's Stone at some point was going to be called Harry Potter the Philosopher's Stone, because I guess ultimately it worked better uh, universally through all the countries everywhere. But then they changed it to Sorcerer's Stone to match the very first book. So at some point somewhere in some parts of countries, they might have gotten the Philosopher's Stone where we got the Sorcerer's Stone. Also, the Chamber of Secrets, the Harry Potter Chamber of Secrets, was called Incident on 57th Street, ultimately to have people not aware that this was, dare say, another Harry Potter film. So it was just done as a pre, like a pre, like while they were filming, they were kind of telling people it wasn't a Harry Potter movie when it actually was. So they just named it that to just kind of give it a little hidden thing going on there. Titanic. The James Cameron movie Titanic was ultimately called Planet Ice. So that way James Cameron could hide the fact from people that he was working on the movie Titanic. Ultimately knowing full well that eventually James Cameron overspent on the movie Titanic. Ultimately, the people giving him the funding was ultimately consistently threatening him that he was going to have to work for free on the movies he did after this, because they thought that the movie wasn't going to make any money. Titanic made a load of money, and I hope that he didn't have to work for free for those next films. Really, the gone people that think that this movie wasn't going to make a lot of money. Titanic? Really? The Russell Crowe movie Robin Hood was almost going to be called Nottingham, which I actually think, honestly, is actually a better title. I honestly do think that that actually works. Because ultimately, you know how many freaking times Robin Hood was just called Robin Hood? The movie about Robin Hood, I think like the Kevin Costner one was probably called like Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, right? Or something like that. But every other Robin Hood movie was just called Robin Hood. I think Nottingham would have been a welcome change, and I think that realistically, that Russell Crowe movie, regardless, isn't a good enough Robin Hood movie to overall just like. If the movie would have been changed to that, I don't think it would have really changed my thought on the film overall. Beetlejuice. If you guys remember the Michael Keaton movie Beetlejuice, Alec Baldwin, and so on and so forth. House Ghosts was going to be what the movie was going to be called instead of Beetlejuice. Ultimately, what had happened is Warner Brothers thought that the movie called Beetlejuice does not work. They thought that House Ghosts sounded much better. No. Reasonably, Tim Burton put his foot down, and he ultimately wanted Beetlejuice to be the title of the movie, because ultimately, Beetlejuice has some like space reference out in space. It has some tying to the Orion's belt. So ultimately, that's why he cemented to want the movie to be called Beetlejuice, because evidently he was, I believe, working with Orion, the company Orion, during this movie, as a little inside joke, I believe. The Ring. If you guys remember the horror movie The Ring, evidently The Ring was going to be called Static. I actually think that that is an actual much better film. If you put it, if, because like The Ring, I didn't really understand what that movie was about, and the movie The Ring did not help. It seems like a lot of times that this Ring character was ultimately coming through ATV anyways. So I think Static actually makes much more sense. And then ultimately with a movie where you have to watch a film and then after that 7 days you would die, I think Static actually works much better as a film. Ultimately, I think there is a lot more titles that ultimately had gotten either changed because they had goofy working titles for that way, so that way people wouldn't know what they were. I know there were much more goofy titles that I probably like didn't put on here because I thought that they were too goofy and this and that. Uh, Looking at it, Hancock. Hancock, I believe, was going to be either called John Hancock or ultimately was going to be called Tonight He Comes. Hancock would have almost been called Tonight He Comes. I believe Hitch, the movie, the Will Smith movie Hitch, was almost going to be called The First Last Kiss. I believe is what it was going to be called. I'm like, well, there is a Drew Barrymore movie called The First Kiss, and I think that the Hitch movie would not have made sense of what it would have been called. There was also, to hide the fact that the Dark Knight was being a thing through the run, through the ringer, through the way of which we went about our lives. Ultimately, I believe the supposedly working title was Rory's First Kiss. I believe is what the working title for The Dark Knight was. To ultimately make it so that Christopher Nolan put that title out there so people would know it was Batman: The Dark Knight. Ultimately, people clearly knew it was going to be a Batman movie. It's kind of hard to hide that kind of thing. Come on, Christopher Nolan. Like, sometimes people are a little bit too smart. You can't just otherwise disguise your movie and not see a man flying around or a guy in a clown mask and ultimately just think people are gonna think it's something else. Uh, there probably are a crap ton of different titles. There probably are a crap ton of different movie titles that had different names. If you want to list down below, movies that had working titles or movies that could have almost been named certain things, let me know in the comments below. I'd like to eventually do another one of these and research what you had put down below and really go through and kind of have some fun with this. Because I know there is a lot of titles, either currently or in distant past, that ultimately had a different working name, had different alternatives, and kind of otherwise just bashingly decided on this and that. Because there's a lot of people that go out of their way to watch commentaries on certain movies, or there's a lot of people that ultimately watch feature-esh like things. I know Ghostbusters, when going into the the Blu-ray or the extra kind of featurettes, they ultimately had mock designs of what ultimately the Ghostbusters logo was going to look like, the actual name of which that they were kind of going with, and this and that. So ultimately, it would be fairly interesting to see a lot more movies that had different title names. So let's play this game together. If ultimately you knew of a movie that had a different title and maybe it was fairly popular, or maybe ultimately is kind of a cult classic, let me know in the comments below. It would be interesting if one of my favorite films ultimately had a different working title. Ghostbusters was kind of one of those where, like, yeah, I heard that it had several different working titles before they ultimately decided on Ghostbusters. So, looking at that, maybe there's a ton more movies out there that have funny titles that actually were going to actually make it on the actual title screen until they just came up miraculously the better name. So yeah, let me know. Let me know if you like some of these titles better. Maybe you like any of these things, or maybe you have your own debate about kind of what works. Maybe what I said work, or what would work, maybe didn't quite work for you. But anything, yeah, let me know if there's other movies that at the end of the day you had a cult following on and you found out it was a different name. There had been a couple of movies that I had seen that evidently were just so bad that they had a name prior to what they ended up being. There was this movie that I saw called Humanoid that ultimately had a different title previously before that honestly didn't quite make sense. I think that there might have been another movie that I reviewed that ultimately kind of had some kind of name that didn't quite make sense to me. But anyways, yeah, like I said, that's what the comments are for. If you dare say enjoy any of these names, let me know. But I'm gonna go here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.